You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Not all simple questions have simple answers.
Mama, why the sky is blue?
How do you explain to an average 5-year-old that it's because sunlight is scattered by gases and tiny particles, and blue light has shorter wavelengths, so it's scattered the most, and that's why we see blue skies?
What?
Experts have enough trouble explaining complex concepts to grown-ups. What chances do we average folk have in explaining them to the little ones? This week in Climate Conversations, we take on deceivingly simple questions put to us by perhaps the toughest inquisitors of all, kids. And since my co-host Jack Board is off somewhere on assignment or on holiday or just slacking off, who knows, we have a very special guest sitting in today with me instead. And he is no stranger to taking tough questions from little tykes. CNA journalist Matt Mohan. Matt, thanks for joining me today on Climate Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you caused quite a stir recently when you visited a preschool to talk about an article you wrote about going plastic-free for a week. You ended up being put in the hot seat instead, didn't you?
For sure. And as a journalist, we are always the ones asking the questions, not answering them. So that was interesting.
Tell me, how did you end up in a preschool talking about plastic pollution?
It started off with me writing a story about going plastic-free for a week in Singapore last year. Because, it was Plastic-Free July. I thought it would be interesting to do an experiment. So I wrote about it. I thought nothing much of it. The story is published. Some interest here, some interest there. And then I received a text from a friend whose son is in preschool, right? And she said, "Oh, they have been studying your story as part of their curriculum. You want to come over and speak to them about your story." So I was quite intrigued, and I spoke to my editor and said, why not let's make a story out of being interviewed. So that's how it came about, and that's how it was.
In your article describing this experience, you wrote about how these preschoolers were very interested in environment and plastic pollution. To what extent was their interest a surprise for you?
Yeah, so they asked a variety of questions. It wasn't just all about plastic-free or the environment. They curious about what a journalist does, what do we do, where do we work? So those were the preliminary questions. But I was surprised at the level of understanding. Clearly, they had read about it. They know what plastics are. They know what to cut down on. And
really?
So, it was quite nice to see that the level of almost environmental literacy was there. And I thought, okay.
Wow, preschoolers, these are like 5 to 6 year olds,
That's right?
4 to 6, I guess. Were there any particular questions about plastics or pollution that floored you or took you by surprise?
For me, I think it was the more personal questions that, because, kids, I wouldn't say have no filter, but they're more direct, right?
Yes.
So when they ask questions, there's no masking of a tough question. They just go straight into it, right? So they just ask stuff like, why do you waste so much plastic? Why do you always forget to bring your water bottle? So clearly I mentioned all these things in my story. So it wasn't so much the scientific aspects of plastic use and waste and pollution, but it was more of me being confronted with my own mistakes,
Okay.
So I had to sort of answer to them like, I always forget, here's what I did to stop myself from forgetting. So it was almost like looking at a mirror.
So it's like defending a dissertation almost, right? You have to make the case for your article and for your behaviors and actions. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So when we invited you to this podcast, we decided to get a few questions from some children we knew around plastics use and its harms to the environment. And I thought at the time that this would be a simple enough, assignment, right? A topic that quite straightforward. I mean, how hard can questions from 5 to 11-year-olds be, right? But then I got the questions and I sent them to you. And honestly, I was up until midnight last night doing research. I mean, this was like more homework than I bargained for.
Oh yeah, it was tough. I mean, I was like, oh no, they're going to be put on the spot again. But these are deceptively simple questions, but the answers are not easy and it's even harder to break it down.
Yeah, and I think that really was part of the challenge, right? It's not just understanding these concepts and the answers to these questions, but also trying to communicate them in a way so that we're not patronizing or even worse, boring, right? So we have 6 questions that you and I will attempt to answer. And to all the kids listening in, let us know if we pass your grade.
Hi, my name is Naida. I am 6 years old and I'd like to know what plastic is made from.
You want to have a stab at this first, Matt?
Oh, this was one of the hardest questions of the lot. Okay, so I think sometimes the hardest questions are the ones you don't even question because you just think that the answer is obvious, right? So I was sent this question from you and I was like, that's a good question. I mean, I roughly know, but how do I break it down, right? So here's how I sort of think about it. First, there's no singular type of plastic. It's not like all plastics are the same, right?
Yeah.
So to understand this, we must understand that there are many types of plastics and there are many different ways of making plastics. So that's the preface to the question.
Yep.
But generally speaking, plastics are polymers. So that seems like a big word, but what are polymers, right? So a polymer is a large molecule that consists of smaller ones called monomers. So polymer to monomer.
What?
I'm going slowly. And then these monomers come from materials found in nature, right? So this can be natural gas, can be oil, and can be plants. So that's sort of the distillation, if you will, of how plastic goes down to materials. Yeah, so that's what I have.
Okay, so my turn.
Yeah.
So lucky for you, Nyla, I actually covered petrochemicals and plastics before. So my challenge was in trying to take my understanding of that and try and simplify it. So basically, plastics are made from crude oil, which is a dirty fuel and one of the bad things that's contributing to global warming, right? And crude oil is the same thing that goes into making petrol for cars, jet fuel for aeroplanes, and it is also used to make plastic. So they add chemicals to it and it becomes this material that then can be melted and molded and extruded, which is basically, they push it out or they blow air in it and turns it into like the bottles of water that we have or, tubes to hold toothpaste and stuff like that. So that's where plastic is from, crude oil. I hope that answers your question, Nyla. Okay, the next one is from Olivia.
Hi, my name is Olivia and I'm 11 years old. And my question for climate conversations is how much plastic does an average person consume in a year?
So this question, I kind of took it two ways. The first one is how much plastic we actually generate and waste. And the second one is how much do we actually ingest. What was your understanding of this question, Matt?
Yeah, so for me, in terms of statistics in Singapore, because I assume that this question is a Singapore context, right?
Yeah.
We don't have individual consumption or use numbers. But what I can find or could find online was the amount of waste generated, the amount of waste recycled. So that's the kind of stuff that's available. So I had those stats and those stats kind of tell a story about just how much waste is not being recycled.
So what did you find out?
So what I found was plastic is the third highest type of waste generated in Singapore.
Oh.
Yeah, among in the categories, right?
Yeah.
And close to 950,000 tons were generated last year.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So this is third highest in category. But I mean, numbers are quite hard to visualize, as you understand. But the scary thing is only 5% of that was recycled.
I think a lot of it too is because we don't have a lot of recycling facilities here. They're very hard to not just operate, but to stay in business. For me, the homework I did also involved the hurdle you had. There was no data or numbers to show us exactly how much plastics we were using per person per year. And the closest to that was the numbers for plastic waste. And you talked about the Singapore one. I looked at the global average, and that basically sums up to about 28 kilograms a person per year, and that's from the Plastic Overshoot Day website on plastic waste. So 28 kilograms is about the weight of an average 9-year-old child. So imagine that every year a person on average uses as much plastics as the weight of a 9-year-old child. But different countries, of course, use different amount of plastic. Some countries, that are more developed, have a much, much bigger population, like America. It generates nearly 3 times as much as that 28 kilograms. So imagine 3 9-year-olds. And then there's countries like Bangladesh, which consumes just a fraction of that at around 8.9 kilograms. Now, the other way I took this question, Olivia, is if you're asking how much we actually consume in terms of how much microplastics that we actually ingest into our body, it's kind of a disturbing figure. It's basically the same as eating a credit card a year. Did you know this, Matt?
I know there are some numbers on microplastics, and that's quite shocking though.
It is. One credit is like, you might as well chew on one credit card now and just get it over and done with, right? The thing though is that it's not quite very clear yet whether this is harmful or not, but it is something that has come up here in Parliament several times actually. And so far the government says that levels here have not raised concerns. But it is something to chew on, that's for sure. Okay, next question.
Hello, I'm Ivy and I'm 11 years old. My question for climate conversations is, how does plastic waste affect the animals living on the land and in the sea?
I think it's an important question because many of us are animal lovers, we love animals, and we want to know what's the kind of impact that it has on them. And I would sort of categorize it into, to be honest, although they live on different environments, the impact is, in a sense, generally similar in terms of land or sea, right? So you first have ingestion, right? Which means that plastic waste being eaten, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's on land or on sea, plastic waste can be eaten by animals for one reason or another. Maybe they think it's food, there's a smell of food, and so they eat it by mistake. And what happens is that sometimes that causes internal injuries because it affects their intestines. It strangles them from within. Yeah,
it goes into their stomach, right?
Yeah.
And then it cuts up their organs.
Exactly, right? So, and I think that applies to both land and sea. It doesn't matter. And sometimes it can be poisonous to them. So it's not just about internal organ damage. It could be poisonous. It could kill them, basically.
Yeah.
And then the other side of things is entrapment. Right? So again, land and sea, same thing. And it's quite shocking because we see pictures of how animals can be trapped in plastic and suffocate and die.
Yeah, it messes up their habitats. I think you and I, we've seen pictures of litter just like, strewn across beaches and swamp areas and forested areas. And it screws up where these animals live. It affects the plants that they feed on and the whole ecosystem, because if they feed on insects, the insects feed on plants, the plants can't survive because they're covered by plastic waste. So this also hits hard at their population. Yeah. And then, when you talk about the ocean as well, I don't know, Ivy, if you've seen these, turtles mistaking plastic bags for jellyfish, which is, a usual food source for them. And so it gets into their bodies and it injures them. And also, I've actually seen videos of hermit crabs, those crabs that make homes out of shells, using bottle caps instead of shells. So it is quite alarming to think about how extensive the impact is on animals on land and sea.
That's right.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Tobias. I am 5 years old. I just want to know what happens if I throw my plastic toys away.
Great question.
Yeah, it is.
Honestly, that's why I appreciated the questions, because some of these we don't think about. I don't think about toys now, right? I don't have kids of my own, but it's been a long time since, I had toys. But I went to do some research and I realized that actually toys contribute quite a lot to plastic waste, because it's hard for toys to be recycled, right? So I think I like the question because it shows that he's been thinking about his personal use, right? Because he plays with toys, he knows of peers or his brother who plays with toys. Yeah. And so he's interested to know what he can do. So that's great, right? That's a great first step.
It's connecting the dots.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I think first things first, Tobias, you need to understand that a lot of toys are just not suitable to be recycled, right? There are some plastics that can be recycled easily, and there are some plastics that cannot be recycled easily. And unfortunately, toys fall under the category, generally speaking, of plastics that cannot be recycled easily, right? And so, firstly, my first recommendation, and I'm sure your parents will be happy to hear this, is that don't throw away your toys quickly. Okay, try to use them for as long as possible. If you have a sibling, that's what siblings are for.
Yes.
Right? And obviously, if it's still working and in good condition and clean, look for places where you can donate them to, because there are people who could use your toys, right? So one important thing about plastics is that we can always reuse. If we can, we reuse, because recycling is not always possible. Yeah, and then if the toy is really spoiled, and it really, really can't be used, then unfortunately so be it. Because generally speaking, it's going to be very difficult to recycle them.
Yeah, and because they can't be recycled, they end up going to the landfills. And what that basically means is they bring all these toys with all the other garbage that cannot be recycled and they bury it underneath the soil. And sometimes they get incinerated, which means that they get burned into ash, and then that ash also goes to landfills. So it's not a very healthy thing for the planet. Thank you for a great question.
Hi, my name's Chia, and I'm 9 years old, and I would like to know what is a good alternative to plastic that is not breakable.
Good alternative to plastic that is not breakable.
That's a tough one because when I did some research for some of these questions and then I look at alternatives, there seemed to be always some problem with the alternatives. I don't know if you had the same experience.
Yeah.
So I was like, what can I recommend that hasn't been an issue? To start off, I think when we think of alternatives, let's not think about buying new things. Because that's one thing I had in my original story, which is let's not buy what we don't need. So when I spoke to some environmental advocates, they spoke about how many people are interested in the environment and they want to do what they can, and so they buy this, they buy that. So I would suggest that if you're really interested in this, and I'm happy you are, to start looking at what you have at home already that can be used. So that's the first step, right? And then when you talk about being breakable, it really depends on what you are looking to use plastic for, right? Because breakable can mean different things in different contexts.
Right.
Like for utensils, for tableware, stuff like that could mean using bamboo, things made of bamboo, right? So that's not breakable, but breakable may differ from glass and heavy duty stuff, right? So that's one thing, one alternative. For bags, even like cloth bags that you reuse, paper bags, they're durable, right?
Yeah.
So stuff like that. But I don't know whether you had any other...
Yeah, I kind of like the point that you made, Matt, about how we are so preoccupied with looking for new things. There are so many alternatives that are being developed, right? Bioplastics, for example. But we forget that there was a time before the age of plastic when people were using things made out of wood, made out of metal. And these things can be used today because they're still around. For example, we have wooden bowls, wooden plates. You mentioned bamboo earlier. Bamboo's great, except I don't think you can microwave it. But
that's true.
You can use ceramics, right? Ceramics is from the earth, it's from clay. So there are options. I think it's just that for whatever reason, in our pursuit of economic might or new solutions, we forget that we can look to the past for some of these very simple answers, right?
Yeah, and the idea is not to buy. If you have, I'm sure in your house you have some of these things. Just use them again.
Yeah, and metal also. One thing about metal is metal can be recycled more easily because it's magnetic. You can extract it from the waste pile quite easily, unlike plastic. So, Chia, you made me really think about this, about finding the simplest solutions that we can use today in modern times. All right, the last question we have is from Pippa.
Hi, my name is Pippa. I'm 7 years old, and my question is, why do grown-ups use so much plastic when they know that it's bad for the planet?
Why do grown-ups use so much plastic, even though we know it's bad for the planet? Great question.
Yes, that's exactly what I thought. I think people generally understand that it is bad for the planet. Doesn't matter whether you're young or you're older. People generally know that plastic wastage is bad. But the problem is that in Singapore, we often don't see the impact that it has on the environment. Or maybe we choose not to see, right? And so when you don't actually see the impact, that obviously it's hard for you to make it a practice for some people.
Or to internalize.
Yes, correct.
We don't see the landfills here, for
Correct.
example. Yeah.
So out of sight, out of mind,
Yes.
that's one thing, right? And also, for many people, it's simply about convenience. Right? I'll do what I want because this is just convenient for me. And if I want to do something for the environment, when it's convenient for me to do that, I do that, right? So the priority is convenience. It is doing what's fast and quick for me.
Yeah. That is correct. A lot of the reason we still use plastic is simply because we're just lazy. We don't want to wash plates or cups, so we use disposable ones. Or we bring single-use plastics to parties or, when we're hosting dinners because We don't want to have to wash these piles and piles of plates and cups, right? We forget to bring our own bags to the supermarket or even bring our own water bottles like you sometimes do, Matt. So a lot of it is because the grown-ups are lazy or we're too busy to really think about it. But then we cannot forget that plastics also have important uses. For example, we use a lot of plastics in the hospitals when you go to the doctors. And that's because plastics can be sterilized, they can be germ-free, and we need to keep them germ-free so that we protect patients, we protect people who are sick or who need to be operated on. Plastic can also be cleaned easily. They keep food fresh and safe. They're waterproof, so they make great packaging for things like toothpaste that we talked about, and for juices and our soda and our medicine. And also plastic protects us from electricity, right?
Yeah.
So it is quite critical. The problem is we're using too much of it, and plastics cannot break down, or they take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to break down.
Yeah.
So this question, Pippa, is important because you're making the grown-ups answer for our behaviors, and our behavior is threatening the future for people like you, for little children. So, yeah, thanks for that one.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point because I don't want us to demonize plastic, right? Like you said, there are many, many good users and important users of plastic. For medicine, contact lenses, like I wrote in my original story, plastic can be used for good things and should be used for good things. But it is the wastage that is a problem.
It goes back to the mantra that we keep hearing about, right? Reduce, reuse, and recycle. Thank you so much, Matt. It was lovely to have you here and to keep me company while Jack is away.
Yeah, I had a good time. It's a bit challenging with some of the questions.
Yes,
but
a lot of homework.
It's good to be challenged,
That's right, absolutely. And that's it for Climate Conversations. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And a huge shout out to all the children who sent in their questions: Nyla, Chia, Olivia, Ivy, Tobias, and Pippa. Until next week, I'm Liling Tan, and Jack Board will be back to join us again. And thanks also to the team that put together this podcast: Tiffany Ang, Junayani Johari, Crispina Robert, and Saye Witt.